Welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate, and today, since I haven't really been posting the last couple months, I wanted to have sort of like a quarter 1 wrap up, and because that wrap up would include around 20 books, I didn't want to just try and bang them all out in a single video, so I have basically split this up into 3 parts. The first part is going to be the 2023 new releases that I have read, which will be the first video that you see. Then I'm going to have a sci-fi fantasy, which is going to be the bulk of these reads. It tends to be the biggest category that I read from. So I have, I think, 9 books that I'll be talking about for that. And then I have a non-SFF, which is going to be mostly horror with 1 mystery tossed in there. So you will see that as the 3rd video in the series, which is, since it's the least number of books, it'll probably be the shortest video of this little series. So I am going to try to be a lot more consistent. I feel like I say that all the time and then just don't follow through. So feel free to give me crap in the comments for never following through with my grandiose plans, but I will attempt to do better going forward here. So without any further rambling, I will get into the 2023 releases that I read in the first quarter of this year, and I will be talking about them basically from least favorite, which is in fact several DNFs, to my absolute favorites. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Keeper 6 by Kate Elliott. Basic premise for this is that you have a world-hopping mom whose last job with her team had gone south and has basically split up the entire team, but she gets a call in the middle of the night from her son who has gotten kidnapped, and she basically has to recruit her team to help her go rescue her son. I made it about 20% into Keeper 6, and that's not a super long time because this is a novella. I think it's around like 120 pages. I'll post the page number here in case I'm completely wrong about that. But it's not that long, but it felt so long. I have enjoyed previous stuff from Kate Elliott. I really liked Servant Mage a lot, which was a novella, but I did kind of feel like the ending of that one was more rushed than I would have liked. I really wish that one had been a full-length novel because the premise for that was so cool. And I think, if I understand correctly, that Keeper 6 is somewhat related to Servant Mage. I didn't get far enough to see where those relations would be, but I have heard that from other reviewers. I also love Kate Elliott's Sun Chronicles series. I read Unconquerable Sun last year? Or was that this year? I've previously read Kate Elliott's Unconquerable Sun, and I'll leave a link to the live show that I did with a couple other booktubers for our book checkout book club, which has been super fun. But, so just a pitch for that in case you are interested in another book club. But we had I really enjoyed that sort of melding of history and space opera. Okay, this is going to be possibly a hot take, but Keeper 6 is kind of the worst of Kate Elliott for me, where it's taking a story that I think could have been interesting if it weren't being jammed into a novella, because you have this world-hopping mom with her team, and the biggest problem for me with Keeper 6 is that Kate Elliott just throws a lot of information at you about this world, and it feels like an info dump, except that you're not really getting the connection to the world, and it's before you care about any of the characters. I need a connection to the characters to care about the world building, and I just never got that in the first 20% of this. And given that I was pretty disappointed in the ending of Servant Mage, I wasn't confident enough to keep going because I wasn't sure that Elliott was really going to pull everything together enough for me by the end. The style of this particular novella wasn't working for me, but I do recommend Kate Elliott generally. I think she writes some really interesting characters. She does political elements really well. So I think she's definitely one to check out if you're curious about her sci-fi and fantasy. Just this one really didn't work for me. So the second DNF that I have to talk about is one that initially got a lot of rave reviews and has since kind of been tempered by people who ended up more in the camp that I ended up in with this book. So it seems like an either love it or hate it book. So definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. Just know that you might have a pretty visceral reaction one way or the other on it. So Last Tale of the Flower Bride is described as a gothic fantasy that I would consider almost magical realism. There's not a lot of fantastical elements in it, but the basic premise is that there's a young man who ends up marrying this very mysterious, very wealthy woman, and the deal when they get married is that he will never look into her past. But when there's a death in her family and they have to go back to the home that she grew up in, he ends up looking into her past, just like he said he wouldn't, and things kind of just go from there. So I ended up DNFing Last Tale of the Flower Bride at 30%. And the biggest part of my dislike for this book is just a writing style mismatch. I can hang with some flowery writing. I have previously enjoyed some books with that, but to be honest, I really only like it in small doses or in short stories. So the language that Chokshi uses for this is almost non-stop metaphors. It's very frequent use of that, very not just flowery, but very visual imagery in a way that really didn't work for me because it felt so over the top. And I really struggled not to roll my eyes once I got past the first couple pages. Some people really love that, and I really don't. So the writing style didn't work for me. I feel like this is also one of those books that's mostly vibes. So if you really like this sort of lush writing style, and if you like a story that's creepy and has a little bit about fairy tales but doesn't delve too much into that, you may really enjoy this book. But for me, it just felt like icing with nothing underneath it. It didn't get enough into fairy tales for me. It does have a toxic relationship that is very central to the story, but I just never really cared about it because I was so annoyed at some of the other elements, so I just never felt invested. I ended up at 30%. I basically just skimmed the rest of the way through so that I could kind of see what happens by the end, and skimming it admittedly is taking me out of the story some, but by the end I was not sad that I had DNF'd at 30%. So I'm not rating this one because I didn't actually finish it from the very beginning, but I wouldn't recommend it if you have reading tastes similar to me, but if your reading tastes are very different, if you enjoy flowery language, if you enjoy a book that's heavy on vibes, you could still really like it. I just would maybe get it from the library so you can find out if you like it before you actually buy it. So that's all I would say, but there's a lot of people who love it, so definitely don't take my review as the only indicator. And I feel like I should point out that if you do end up really liking this book, Fairyloot has an absolutely gorgeous version of this that has these beautiful sprayed edges and really neat end papers. So I think, and I'll show this side too, which has two of the characters are in here. Not the bridegroom, but the other two characters that are a major component. So I think if you really like it, it's probably worth picking it up because it's a gorgeous edition. I wish I had liked it because I really like the work that they did on that edition. I just can't justify keeping something that I really didn't like. The next one that I'm going to talk about, which is one that I finished and has an absolutely gorgeous edition, is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. It took me a while to get this copy of it because I think it was one of the last batches that got the Kickstarter editions of these sent out, but I really enjoyed this. So I ended up giving this an 8.4 out of 10. I do use the Compile rating system. I'll have a link to the video on that in case it's not something you're familiar with. And that equated to 4.5 stars for those of you who enjoy these star ratings. I think overall what I can say about Tress of the Emerald Sea is that I really enjoyed it. I just had a fun time with this story. I don't know that it's necessarily a new favorite for me. The basic premise for this is that there's a young girl who's in an isolated island village, and her best friend gets kidnapped, and she basically sets aside her kind of day-to-day life in order to go rescue him. And I have only read one other book by Sanderson, and that is Warbreaker. And this is a significant departure in terms of writing style. It is very snarky, very meta. There are a lot of comparisons with this one to Princess Bride, not necessarily in the storytelling, like the plotline part of it, but very much in the narrative voice. So there is a character who is basically telling you this story of what happened with Tress. And I won't say who it is because that can be a fun discovery, especially if you're already familiar with the Cosmere. You've probably already read this and heard about it long before now if you are a fan of Cosmere. But it is a fun element to it, and it is that same removed sort of narration where he's commenting on the different story beats in a typical fantasy story and kind of making fun of some of the tropes and commenting on how Tress is a very sensible girl, but he doesn't fall into the not like other girls trope, which is fun. So he kind of makes fun of that. So that was really fun. But I will admit that it also kind of removes me from falling as in love with the characters as I might have otherwise. There's just a sort of distance with that narrative storytelling technique. So I think that's really the main thing that brings it down from maybe like a 5-star to more like a 4.5 for me, is just that sort of distance. I liked Tress. I just never... I didn't connect with Tress on the same level as some of the other books that I read in the first quarter. I just enjoyed it. So, I mean, if the worst I can say is that it wasn't an all-time favorite, but I still had a really good time, that's a pretty good book. And I definitely feel like you can enjoy this even if you're not familiar with the Cosmere, because like I said, I've only read Warbreaker, and I read Warbreaker like 10 years ago. So I don't think you need to be familiar with it in order to enjoy it. I do think that you will get more out of it if you have those Cosmere connections, because you will catch the Easter eggs that I know I didn't catch. Like, I vaguely know who the narrator is for this, but only because I talked to someone about it. Like, I think it's a character who does show up in Warbreaker, but very briefly. So, again, it will be more enjoyable if you have those, but you don't need them to pick this up. And I think I'm actually probably going to return to this after I've caught up on the Cosmere so that I can catch some of those things that I missed the first time around. So overall, I just had a really good time reading this. I did mostly listen to the audiobook for this one, which is narrated by Michael Kramer. I know people are either in the love or hate camp with Kramer, but I really enjoyed his narration of it. I thought he did a great job. So definitely one that I would overall recommend, regardless of whether or not you're a Cosmere fan. And I think if you can get one of the versions, I think there's... I want to say the regular US version also has some of the art that this has. So there's these neat end papers in here, and then there's art and kind of really, so that's some of the art there. And you also have neat sort of chapter heading details as well. I don't know if the camera will pick up on that, but just on a physical design level, they did a really incredible job with this book. So I am glad that I really enjoyed it. I'm not upset that it's not a new favorite, because I think, again, it is one of those that I can see myself returning to in the future and still really having a good time with. The next one I'm going to talk about is another special edition, and in fact, all of the books that I have here, except for Keeper 6, which I don't own, are special editions. So I am doing a better job so far this year with reading the special editions that have come out this year. So yay me, because that's something I'm terrible at normally. But the next one I'm going to talk about is Godkiller by Hannah Kaner, and this is I think it's a Illumicrate. Pretty sure it's a Illumicrate. Yes, this is the Illumicrate edition, which is just stunning. I freaking love the stag that's on the front of this one. They've got neat sprayed edges, which are kind of disrupted by all my tabs there. And then the other thing I really like about this edition is that the naked hardcover actually has all the characters on there. I felt like they did an amazing job representing these characters on here. I have a killer of gods, a retired knight, and a noble girl who is tied to this god of white lies, and they all need to beg a favor from the gods, but in order to do so, they have to go to this city that was destroyed during a war between the gods. And they are going to have to, they all want to go for separate reasons, but they need to work together in order to actually make it to that city alive and then hopefully make it back out. So it was a standard, like, I am a huge fan of the ragtag crew of separate people that all have to work together and kind of get along, but also kind of don't. And just very different personalities. Like, that always really draws me in. So this was kind of one that I knew going in I would probably really like. I had also heard reference to one of the main characters, the Godkiller, which is Kissin here, being what I've heard referred to as a sasshole. So sassy asshole for anybody who doesn't make that connection. And sort of not quite himbo, but definitely a very physically capable sword fighter type figure. So, I mean, your mileage may vary with some of these characters. The knight who's in the story, Elogast, is definitely in the loyal paladin camp. And then the noble girl, Inara, is less appealing in terms of kind of being more of a standard young character, but she has interesting implications are tied to her and to this god of white lies, who is this little rabbit guy that's up there. I really enjoyed these characters a lot. I'm partial to Kissin's character archetype because I just, as you may notice from the fact that I love Gideon, I just really enjoy the female fighter who's sarcastic and very prickly, but generally has their heart in the right place. That's like an archetype that I will just absolutely eat up. So I really loved that element. There's a pretty neat handling of disabilities in here. I really liked the way that Kaner sort of wove in all these different identities without anything feeling like they were being set up as the token representation of that. I will say, I know that some people have not enjoyed this as much. It's quite short. It's a little over 300 pages, I think. And it reads kind of slow for something that is that short. It really does remind me a lot of The Witcher in terms of the gods among us and sort of a writing style that draws you in, but also doesn't read super fast necessarily. I think this is less formal writing than The Witcher is, and I like the characters more, but I think there are definitely some similarities to be drawn there. And in a lot of ways, Kissin as a god killer has very strong Witcher monster hunter vibe. I think the other thing to know going in with Godkiller is that the world building, I think, is done really well, except that you don't get all the answers. You're kind of getting this taste of the world via these different characters. You are switching POVs pretty frequently. Like every chapter usually is a different POV. And I don't mind that because I thought it was interesting to get the different perspectives on the worlds and on gods, because obviously Kissen is going to have a much more negative outlook on gods than someone like Inara, who has not really had that kind of experience with them. So I kind of liked that, and I'm not the kind of person who needs all of the answers in the first book. I am perfectly okay with being introduced to some of these elements and just having to wait for some of the answers for future books. But I have definitely heard complaints from other readers that they didn't feel like they got the full picture or a big enough picture for their particular preferences. So your mileage definitely may vary in terms of how much you enjoy the world building. I really, between the interesting elements with the gods, the characters I really enjoyed, and a plot line that really worked for me, I ended up giving this one a 9.4, which came out to 5 stars. I really loved this. I can't wait to see where Kaner goes with the rest of this series. And I honestly, as much as I love short fantasy, because let's face it, I feel like there's not that many short fantasy books out there, I wouldn't mind if she had a longer story with these characters. So I didn't feel cheated by the length of this, but I definitely would eat up anything else that Kaner puts in this series. So definitely excited to see where she goes with that one. Final new release that I'm going to be talking about is one that has already been getting a fair amount of hype, and I'm just going to be contributing to that. And that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. Again, another gorgeous edition. I think this one is Fairy Loot? Yes. So this one is Fairy Loot. I think they did a spectacular job with this one again. Really, really fun end papers with the characters in them. So I just absolutely adored this. This is one of... I've been thinking about doing a video about cozy fantasy. This is one of very few cozy SFF wins for me. I really struggle to get along with that subgenre because it frequently is a lot slower than I want it to be. It tends to be a little more sentimental in a way that doesn't always work for me. So I was really surprised by how much I adored this book. The basic premise is that you have this scholar, Emily Wilde, who is going out and researching the Fae on this particular isolated sort of Scandinavian island. And she ends up really kind of, she's a fairly prickly person, and so she ends up kind of struggling to get along with the townsfolk and accidentally offending some of them in spots because she's just not very good at navigated human relationships. She'd just much rather be like nose in her books and like studies. And I feel like as I've gotten older, I've started really liking these sort of prickly, somewhat antisocial characters. So I don't know what that says about me, but I really identified a lot with Emily in terms of her not always being very smooth in her interactions with others and kind of putting her foot in her mouth without realizing it. I just definitely identified a lot with that. She reminded me a lot of Lady Trent from the Memoirs of Lady Trent, except that I enjoyed her more because she was prickly and she was kind of obsessed with her studies. But there's just the relationships that she ends up developing with some of the other characters in this story really made me enjoy her a lot more. I also really enjoyed sort of the epistolary way that this is told, because you get it through her diary entries, and she ends up being helped out by a fellow scholar who she has a she has sort of a complicated relationship with, where she doesn't necessarily want to accept their help, but they've kind of like wormed their way into her good graces. And it's just really fun to see them bantering back and forth and like kind of pushing each other out of their comfort zones. it was just really fun. I do think, and that other character is Wendell Bamblebee. If you hear reference to him from the synopsis or other reviews, and I think your mileage may vary with how much you like him because he is definitely on the arrogant side. He comes across as a bit callous and really only concerned about his own advancement. He definitely has a softer side, but I think some people may really get rubbed the wrong way by some of the details of his personality. So go in knowing that you may or may not love him as much as I do, but I had such a great time with him. There are a couple scenes that just had me laughing that are specifically related to him. I don't want to spoil anything, but I just really enjoyed his character and the way he and Emily kind of meshed. I also really enjoyed the representation of fairies in this because I tend to not be super interested in stories with the Fae where its focus is on them being sexy and dangerous. I really want them to be dangerous and capricious and care the type of creatures that if you put a foot wrong, you will die or be cursed with something awful for the rest of your life. You know, like I want to feel like there's a real threat there, and it's not just that they're sexy, almost humans. So I really like the way that Fawcett handled fairies in this because they are very much. You need to bribe them with gifts. You need to treat them with a certain courtesy, or you will be in very serious trouble. So I loved that. They don't feel human, they feel like something else. And I really, really appreciated that about this story. That kind of darker take on the Fae is something that I really liked in other books that I read growing up. Kind of the more traditional take on fairies where they're not necessarily very nice. So again, that's something that I really enjoyed in this one. So this was absolutely one of my favorites of the quarter. I think there's only one book that's going to rival it that I will be talking about in the next video. So you will see that, but that's really the only one that could rival my affections for this one in this first quarter. Okay, so editing Kate here. I apparently just wandered off after I was raving about Emily Wilde. So let me know about any 2023 releases that you really loved this year, or if you've read any of the ones that I talked about here. Definitely let me know your opinions below. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.